Good evening. A Chinese mouthpiece has come out with a report, an article which claims that if the two neighbors cooperate and reconcile their competing interests, China and India can become major maritime powers with the potential to rule the waves. A strategic analyst named Wang Xinlong from Tianjin Normal University wrote the piece in the state-run Global Times. The piece, however, also raises questions about how to actually achieve the reconciliation of overlapping interests of both the countries. Stating that there are huge contradictions in the maritime strategies of the two countries, Xinlong states further that these contradictions can be resolved by peaceful communication. Referring to China's reservations about India's push into the Asia-Pacific, where China has a host of maritime disputes, as well as Chinese efforts to gain influence in the Indian Ocean region, long considered as India's pond, the piece also says that their relationship can shape the security environment in the whole Indo-Pacific region. Both sides, Xinlong expects, will continue to pay increasing attention to each other in the maritime realm and have more interactions at sea in the future. India and China have been at loggerheads with one another on a host of issues besides the well-publicized South China Sea issue. The dispute over India's northeastern border area still lingers, and India has been increasingly concerned about rising Chinese influence with its neighbors like Sri Lanka and Maldives under what the Chinese call the string of pearls strategy. Analysts say that China, which underwent a once-in-a-decade leadership change this month, is looking to scale up relations with India in the backdrop of a big American push into the Asia-Pacific region, solidifying ties with countries like the Philippines and Vietnam, while continuing to back their claims over the South China Sea. Now, ladies and gentlemen, tonight on The Big Picture, we discuss this new push towards an amicable partnership that China seems to be interested in. To what extent is the Chinese thrust on mutual cooperation on high seas influenced by the US declaring that it will deploy 60% of its military assets in the region? And the bigger question, of course, can India buy peace with its northern neighbor? Joining me tonight is TCA Rangachari, former ambassador, also Professor Srikant Kondapelli, who's a professor of Chinese studies in JNU. Also joining us for the first time on The Big Picture is Avinash Godbole from IDSA. In just a bit, we'll try and get you views from Pramit Chaudhri as well, who's the foreign affairs editor of the Hindustan Times. I'd like to start with Professor Kondapelli, if I could. Sir, it is not just the Global Times article. A top Chinese expert, Li Junru, has said that China and India should get over unfortunate incident that happened in the past, referring to the border issues as well, and open new chapter in their relationship. How do you view this fresh approach, if I can call it that?
Vis-a-vis the India-China relations, I don't think there is a fresh approach by either Li Junru, who is now visiting India. He's from the Central Party School and served under Xi Jinping, the General Secretary, the new General Secretary of the party. He's only reiterating the position that there could be prospects for growing bilateral relations between the two. On the first aspect of the maritime cooperation, it is quite understandable that China is airing those views because 60 to 70% of China's GDP is on the high seas and hence the concern on the maritime domain. In terms of India, it is not clear from Wang Xinlong's article whether China is wanting India's role in the East China Sea, South China Sea, and other areas contiguous to China. Is it only that he is asking for Chinese role in the Indian Ocean?
Right.
It's not very clear what his position
sort of
is.
Hazy there. I want to go to TC Rangachari. Your views on this. Mr. Kondapelli doesn't think it's a fresh approach at all. Do you agree with him?
Well, if you go back about 6 years when Hu Jintao visited India, at that time he talked in terms of how China had taken a considered view that it wants to have a long-term strategic partnership with India. And he had also said that this way they wanted to demonstrate to the world that two countries with different social economic systems could work together for mutual benefit and for peace and stability in the region and the world. So from that point of view, what is now being said about a cooperative partnership between the two countries is not strictly speaking new. I would agree also with Professor Kondapelli that insofar as the maritime aspect is concerned, the lack of clarity apart, it's also maybe time because of the fact that a maritime dialogue is to take place between the two countries. There is also the high-level visits which are projected before the end of the year.
I think Shivshankar Menon is going on.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. So this creates a kind of a atmosphere that China, we still don't know because the new leadership has not taken over, whether there is any change in emphasis. But I think there is a duality here which China faces, which I think India also faces. On the one side, both countries, from China's point of view as well as India's point of view, need to work together. They need to cooperate in their own interests. At the same time, there is also an element of differences in several different ways. And there is time, we could go into the details, but there are several differences. And these differences have to be addressed. On the border question which you referred to in your opening remarks, okay, we can come back to that later.
I want to get Avinash in just, you heard what my previous two speakers just said. It's not just the Chinese then. Nirupama Rao, the Foreign Secretary of India, today said that India is looking to engage China, develop more habits of cooperation with China, that India is not looking to isolate China at all. Can we then call this a thaw in relations on both sides, or at least an attempt to do so?
Well, there has always been a process of maintaining peaceful relations. And India realizes at this point that despite the differences of opinion on border and territories, India and China will have to cooperate on economic affairs, and they are better off by cooperating on economic affairs and other matters of concern on international fora like climate change and trade. So that's why there are always these efforts on, and I think this is a welcome effort at this point of time.
Right. Coming back to Professor Kondapelli, I come back to the question, Professor, raised by Wang Xinlong. No matter how much cooperation is achieved in whatever sphere, it is but natural that China and India will compete in a multitude of spheres and areas. Does it mean then, and I can borrow Mr. Xinlong's question that he put in the article, that China and India are destined to be rivals? Are China and India destined to be rivals? And if they are, how should the two countries reconcile competing interests, maritime or otherwise?
I think there is no inveterate hostility between India and China.
There are competing interests.
There are competing interests on various aspects. There is also cooperation between India and China as developing countries in the Doha round, in climate change proposals, in a host of other fora, multilateral fora like BRICS. We have had cooperation. Well, there are some genuine reasons why they have not been able to build up a relationship. One is obviously the unresolved territorial dispute, which breeds a lot of suspicion between the two sides. Then you have also the Chinese cooperation with Pakistan in the ballistic missile defense, ballistic missile programs, and China's role in South Asian region, as you have just mentioned, in terms of Sri Lanka and a host of other countries. So these are concerns that China needs to address. If India also responds in a similar way by, for example, building naval bases in Vietnam or with Japan, or improving relations, say, with Taiwan, I think we will have much more animosity between India and China.
Right.
If India follows a similar approach as Chinese are following.
Even if we, Mr. Rangachari, even if we do manage to work out a solution, will that solution in fact be productive to both sides? Will they take care of each other's interests and protect each other's rights? Do you think that's possible?
This is, you're speaking of the border issue, or you're speaking generally of...
General cooperation, maybe it's the border issue, maybe the maritime issue, but even if we do manage to work out a solution, do you think both countries would be equally happy or equally happy with the result? Is that possible?
Well, if you're speaking specifically of the border issue, and if India and China come to any kind of a mutually acceptable settlement, which does not seem to be in the offing, you would recall
that was my question. Is that at all possible?
Well, you know, you would recall that Panchapa, when he came here a couple of years ago, he had said that this is something which is going to take a long time, should be left over to the future generations and so on. So I think this is a question that nobody can predict as to whether there would be a change in the Indian position, change in the Chinese position, whether there is something which makes a mutual accommodation that is mutually satisfactory possible. But that apart, the question that both India and China have to ask themselves is that even if, in the case of China, their entire claims in regard to the territory in Arunachal Pradesh, let's say, gets sorted out to their satisfaction, does it solve China's problems? And the reverse question also in the case of India, because our problems are not so much the territorial problems. The problems are for different kind. These are internal. And this is not something which is going to go away either in the case of China or in the case of India. It's going to take us a fairly long time to address and resolve these problems, whether it is of economic development, poverty, inequality, the rural-urban differentials, and so on. Now, therefore, the possibility of cooperation building on the commonality of problems is very real, and it should be possible for both of us to work together.
Right.
It's now a question that both governments have to take as to what extent they want to emphasize the differences and to what extent they want to emphasize commonalities.
Right, right.
Does not mean that the difference will go away.
Right. I want to get Avinash's view on this as well. Even if both countries, Avinash, manage to work out a solution, overlooking past disputes and festering, nagging bilateral issues, the question being asked by China watchers currently is that, like I put the question to Mr. Rangachari as well, will it be an equitable compromise that will respect and protect each other's interest? Is that even possible given the history between the two countries?
Why not? It is possible. And if there has to be an agreement, it has to be a shared solution to the problems. And unless it's a mutually agreeable solution, it won't be reached. So it's good that dialogues are happening. And to the extent that dialogues are happening, there's hope and there's optimism in the process there.
On that note, we'll take a small break right now. We'll come back and we'll discuss more on the bilateral issues between China and India. Come back on the other side of this break. Keep watching The Big Picture. Welcome back. You're watching The Big Picture and we're discussing possible cooperation, mutual cooperation between China and India on a host of issues, be it border issues, border disputes or maritime cooperation. I want to come to TC Rangachari right now. Coming back to the maritime boundaries issue, sir, China says that their claims are backed by history and are in accordance with tradition. Now, Li Junru gave a comment which I think suitably outlines China's position. Li said, and I quote, "We don't want to use force or intimidation. We will not act recklessly, but if someone uses force against us, we will not sit quiet." Doesn't that mean, sir, that even though China is talking a good game, on the verge of sounding benign, it is always going to carry a big stick?
Well, I think that is the kind of language which is open to interpretation. One of the things that they say is that, yes, we are spending a fair amount insofar as military expenditure is concerned, but this is only in order to defend China's territory. Now then the question comes up, what is China's territory? If disputed areas are claimed, that as claimed by the Chinese, are part of this quote-unquote Chinese territory and they are going to defend it, inevitably there is going to be a clash with those whose claims conflict with China's claims. Therefore, when the Chinese say that, you know, we are going to not sit back and sit quiet in case somebody intrudes or somebody does anything against China's territorial integrity or whatever, so far as it is a statement, I think it is all right, because similar kind of statements are made by others also. But if they are going to carry it to its logical conclusion and say either that we are going to use force in order to enforce our claims, or we are going to use force in order to change the status quo, then we are in a difficult situation. And that is something that the Chinese need to worry about, because today the impression that is there amongst the neighbors of China is that China is, and this is something which the Prime Minister said about 2 years ago in a press conference, that China is being very assertive. Now, for the Prime Minister, who doesn't normally use words like that, to say that means that he must have been sufficiently concerned to say that in public. And as far as Chinese defense expenditure is concerned, today it is larger than India's and Japan's combined.
Right.
So these are things which they have to take into account in dealing with their neighbors.
I've been told that Pramit Chaudhri has joined us, Foreign Affairs Editor of the Hindustan Times. Welcome to the show. Pramit, we're discussing, of course, on a couple of articles that came out today, and of course also what Li Junru has said, and the question of how India and China can increase the mutual cooperation, be it maritime or otherwise. My guests over here on your right seem to think that this is not a new or fresh approach. It is a good move. Yes, there are benign utterances on both sides. Today, Nirupama Rao said that it does not really want to, India doesn't want to isolate China at all, but want to see it as a benign power in the region. How do you look at the Global Times article that came out today and what Li Junru said and what India is saying right now in the context of maritime cooperation or otherwise?
Well, yes, I think based on what others have said just now, the issue that China blows hot and cold at different times. What is not clear, however, is why it blows hot and cold. Why is China necessarily aggressive for a 2 or 3 year period? If you look at it up to the Sikkim agreement, we had a very good relationship. We seem to be on a very good trajectory with China. Then it suddenly went downhill for 2 or 3 years. They picked a fight not only with us, but with almost all of their neighbors. Now suddenly, especially since the Wen Jiabao visit, China is now becoming much more benign and making friendlier noises to India, even while it's still being assertive to Japan, against Japan and in the South China Sea. But ultimately, the real issue is, why does China do what it does? Why does it change its policy every now and then? Why does it suddenly be assertive, not be assertive? That's the real fundamental question, because it's not that other countries don't do this, but at least we can work out why.
Right.
In the Chinese, it's a sort of a black box. It's an opaque system. That's what troubles other countries, because I would argue that they do not know, they're not completely certain why China does this, and therefore they cannot predict whether China will do this again, whether it will be assertive or necessarily benign.
Right. Professor Kondapelli, why does China do this? Why blow hot and cool every 2-3 years?
Well, obviously there is the competing interests within the foreign policy establishment as well as the party. And the party also needs to consider the rising nationalism in addition to the Chinese military's position in the overall decision-making process. So I think they are factoring in so many influences that are coming up time and again. For example, last 2 months, you have over 100 cities witnessed anti-Japanese protests. Some reports suggested to the differences within the Politburo Standing Committee, the previous Standing Committee, where you had Chow Yun-kang, who was closer to Po Xilai, and he was in charge of the police. There is a rumor that he had orchestrated the anti-Japanese protests. So why does this happen is partly because of the internal situation, political situation in China.
Would you agree with that, Avinash, that partly it's because of the internal situation there? There's a tug of war within the party itself?
Yes, I think it happens in the case of China. When the domestic tensions rise, it's likely, and it does happen, that some faction uses nationalism to divert the attention. And it's also likely that because the party congress was happening, there was a lot of attention on issues. Nationalism is always going to support the party to stay in power and consolidate its position. So to that extent, this has been happening over the past 6 months. Foreigners being threatened in China, in Beijing, in other cities, Japanese and Southeast Asian countries being used aggressive language against, and such things. Yes.
Right. On that note, we'll take another short break. We'll come back. We'll discuss the crux of this discussion, the crucial question that I want to ask my panelists. Can India really buy peace with its northern neighbor? Also, we'll discuss the rising noises by the US on deploying their military assets in that region. That's after the break. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to The Big Picture. Let me come to Rishi Rangachari right away. How far are these benign utterances, my lord, that's a very harsh word, but I'm still going to go with that, benign utterances, influenced or being forced by the increasing momentum that an alliance against China, which now includes the US, Australia, as well as Japan to some extent, the US has declared if need be, they will be deploying 60% of their maritime defensive assets in that particular region. That must be playing on Beijing's mind to some extent.
Well, as far as the Chinese are concerned, it's very clear that the only country whom they consider, if I might use that term, worth competing with is the United States. Clearly, there is a duality again insofar as China and US is concerned. There is a great deal of interdependence, and that interdependence is very evident in the economic sphere. You had 4 years ago Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, saying that there would be a G2 of United States and China to manage global affairs. That is one approach. And again, when President Obama visited China in 2009, there was a role that China had been accorded in the joint statement in regard to South Asia. So that is one part of it. The other part of it is that when, as in the case of what happened in South China Seas, when China's neighbors are alarmed at what they see as the possibilities of China taking military action in order to enforce its claims, then they're forced to rush to the United States. It becomes obligatory for the United States to assure them that they are not going to abandon these countries. Not necessarily because there is an alliance system at work in the case of Asia, as there is in the case of Europe. But to say that the United States and China are in a conflict situation, or that the Americans are trying to create an alliance system to contain China, I think at this point is premature.
It's too early to say.
Because there are a number of statements which have been made by the President, by the Secretary of State, by the Defense Secretary of the United States, and so on, very clearly saying that the relationship with China is very important, it has to be managed, and the United States plans to work with China as constructively as is possible.
Pramit, do you agree with that? Mr. Rangachari thinks the US is not really pushing the buttons, the Beijing is not really worried about what the US is doing right now?
I think Beijing is concerned, as he's mentioned, that this is the only genuine competitor that China sees globally is the United States. The United States flirted with the G2 policy for about the first 16 months of the Obama administration. China expressed no interest, so America gave up on it. Then the pivot to Asia, which will now, I would argue, be the dominant theme in the next Obama administration and the new one, much more so because Iraq and Afghanistan are now sort of off the radar for him. We will see, I think, a hardening on the China position. But the Americans, as so do we, and so do the Japanese, make it very clear we want to work with China. China is the number one or number two trading partner with almost every country in Asia, and in fact most of the countries in the world. China has a lot to offer, and if China is stable and benign, then it will be an enormously powerful and constructive force in the global system.
Right.
The real problem is that it continues to be that China seems to allow its domestic politics to override all of its strategic sense, if you wish, and suddenly become assertive. So the Americans, like we, basically now have a hedging strategy. Yes, we'll work with you, but we'll keep our gunpowder dry because we simply don't know what you're going to be doing next week.
Do you agree with that, Avinash, what Pramit just said? I think he makes a lot of sense.
Yes, I think all of the countries in Asia, even the United States, have a duality of relationship with China. On the one hand, you have trade relations are extremely important, extremely interlinked, intermeshed economies, and on the other hand, strategically you're not sure which way China is going, as was just said, of the differences of opinions over a period of time. So the basic question remains as to how you manage the duality of approaches towards China, and towards that extent there's a assimilation of interest of different countries in Asia. Not more than that.
Right. This gets me to my crucial question that we're asking on the big picture tonight, of course. Can India buy peace with this northern neighbor? I want to come to Professor Kondapelli first. Is there a realistic chance, that India and China can buy peace from each other, whether on the border issue or the maritime issue or otherwise?
Well, the Himalayan region had provided for permanent peace for over 2,000 years almost between India and China, the two civilizations. I don't think why this cannot be possible in future. If Soviet Union / Russia and China had permanent peace in the 1990s, mid-1990s, with the border dispute resolution, demobilization of troops from the border areas, complete, including the June 2001 joint declaration between Russia and China, which went for the strategic cooperation between the two in real terms, not in rhetorical terms. I don't see why it cannot be possible. But the one main condition, obviously, is territorial dispute resolution in this.
That's the tricky part, isn't it?
And that's the tricky part. Right. And I don't see any resolution happening for the next 15, 20 years because it's so complicated. You first have to define, delimit, demarcate the entire 3,488 kilometers long border.
Mr. T.C. Rangachari, is it possible to buy peace with a neighbor which, according to Pramit, as Pramit just said, blows hot 3 years and blows cold 3 years? We don't really know what they're going to do next.
Well, I wouldn't use the term buy peace because that suggests that somehow, you're paying a
bribing
price
or bartering
without getting anything in return. I quite agree with Professor Kondapelli that insofar as the border issue is concerned, this is not amenable to a solution in the coming days or weeks or months.
It's a long drawn process.
Short of that, leaving that aside, if both countries are willing, as they have been in the course of the last close to 50 years now, that the peace will not be disturbed along the border, irrespective of whatever our perceptions, whatever our differences might be, there is no reason why India and China cannot work together. And in fact, in some ways, it might even make sense from India's point of view to be a little more forthcoming in seeking China's cooperation, to test the Chinese as to whether they are really willing to go as far as they say in working together with China. It's not simply a question of climate change at the international, the global level. It's not in the context of BRICS. Again, very many of the issues are at the global level. But to see in the regional context whether we can work together, whether India and China can work for the benefit of our neighbors in South Asia, China's neighbors in Southeast Asia, and so on. And then see to what extent this cooperation can lead to a better understanding and better cooperation between the two sides.
Right. We're almost out of time, but I want to give one last question to Pramit to make up for lost time. Wrap this up for us. It is a long drawn process. The border issues are very tricky. The maritime discord will take its own time. How does India tackle all of this?
Well, I think India will basically have to tell China, look, on the carrot side, we are prepared to do trade. We are prepared to open up to investment on both sides. We are prepared to talk as constructively as possible about the border agreement. We don't have any argument with each other that really is fundamental to the security policies of either country. So let's work on those issues. But at the same time, India has also had to realize, I think in the past 5 years, that China will occasionally, for reasons that we do not fully understand, come and suddenly poke us in the ribs. But China responds to very strong responses. And we did respond. I think when one American diplomat told me, he says, no other Asian country gave as violent a response to what as India did in the past 3 years.
Right.
And the Chinese learned a lesson from that. And that's something we always have to keep in mind with China.
Right.
That ultimately, because of this hot and cold problem, we always have to be able to respond strongly, even while we're doing the carrots.
Absolutely. I think that's the key takeaway from today's discussion. I must thank all my guests before I sign off. Pramit Chaudhri, Avinash Godbole, TCA, Rangachari, and Professor Kondapelli. Like Pramit said, dole out the carrots, but carry a big stick. Athar Khan saying goodbye, good night, and thank you for watching The Big Picture.